All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I just have a couple of housekeeping notes before I turn things over to Catherine Lee. If you have a question at any time, please feel free to go ahead and pop that right in the Q&A function, or you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will make it so that you can ask your question live. You'll just want to make sure that you unmute your microphone before you do that. But we are very excited for this presentation and we want to answer all of your questions, so don't hesitate if you have something brewing. And now I'll turn it over to our web editor, Catherine Lee.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our very first Journalism 207 session. We hope this is the first of many and that you all find it really interesting and join us for more. Today we have with us Eric Russell, who writes news features for the Portland Press Herald, and Vanessa Paolella, who covers education for the Lewiston Sun-Journal, to talk about how they find good stories. While they both currently cover specific beats, they've also both written on a wide range of topics, from crime to business to features. So feel free to ask them anything you want to know about working in journalism. Eric and Vanessa will talk about how they got into the business and then how they find their best stories. I know some of you asked a question in advance, so thank you for that. I'll bring those questions up at the end during the question and answer period, but if you have a question you want to ask live, put it in the chat box. I'm going to kick off the session with an advanced question from one of the students, and then I'll let Eric and Vanessa take over from there. So let's start with Vanessa. How did you know this was what you wanted to do for a living? What motivated you?
I didn't. I think it's probably the best first genuine answer. I only decided I was going to pursue this professionally, honestly, 3 years ago. Honestly, it might be even more fair to say a year ago. It had been a side passion of mine for a really long time, since high school. And I kind of took a chance. I graduated with a degree in geology, so I wasn't exactly preparing for a career in journalism. But the great thing I think about this industry is that it's really knowledge based, so you can really apply what you know as long as you learn the techniques to write. So I just really like the energy of the newsroom. I really like being on top of the information, what's new, what's important to people, and helping to provide that information. So that's kind of what tipped it for me for pursuing this.
Why don't you keep going and tell us a little bit about how you find good stories and how you ended up with covering education?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a little bit about me, maybe to start, is I started writing in high school. I took a class second year of high school, and it really sparked my interest. I got to college. I wasn't going to join my college newspaper, and then I did because I had a friend. And it kind of just snowballs. And so I'm now a year out of graduating from college. I'm 23, and here I am. So for the Sun Journal, I'm the education beat reporter. And in case any of you guys aren't familiar with what a beat is, it means it's kind of your specialty. That's what you really focus on your writing. So as Catherine said, I primarily write about education, but I also write other things. And so today I'm on the cops beat. I'm doing breaking news if it happens. So
is it hard to jump back and forth from education one day to covering cops another day?
No, it's really fun. It keeps it interesting. I think some days I kind of just need a break from education, because a lot of the basis of my education reporting is meetings. I have meetings like a few times a week for different school districts, and so that kind of is the bread and butter of my beat. And then it's working from there to build more interesting stories that involve me talking with more people. So it's nice to sometimes just have a little bit of a break where I don't have to think too much about that and I can regroup. But I think this is a good time to talk about how I find my stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let me move into that. So for me, again, a lot of what I do is regularly going to meetings. For Lewiston, I attend school board meeting every 2 weeks, and that's kind of where I get little bits of information. But I think a lot of what really leans itself into finding good stories is going a little bit beyond the bare day-to-day bones. So one of the things that I found, I'm now a little over 6 months into working for the Sun Journal, is really important to be in person. And I know that's a really basic thing to say, but I can't stress it enough how much. I think that's very important for being a beat reporter, because part of being a beat reporter is developing relationships with people. Because when something happens, like I'm not in the Lewiston School District, I'm not a student, I'm not a staff, I don't have a ton of like personal connections, and so you want to put yourself in a position where people think of you when something's happening. And so I can't always do it, but I make a big effort to attend all my meetings in person when I can. And it paid off for me really early on. And so I reflect back to Oak Hill High School, that school district based in like Sabattis, Wales, Litchfield. It was my first time going to a school board meeting for them, and I came in person, and lo and behold, there was a pretty big conflict going on. And so all the, all these school board meetings are generally recorded. Most of the school districts around me record it, so a lot of times I can watch it later. But in this particular school district, they hadn't even started the camera yet because they hadn't started the meeting because somebody wasn't wearing a mask. And so the chairman was refusing to start the meeting and was having an argument with the attendees. There's about 20 of them. And it ended the meeting. And so anybody who was waiting for this school committee meeting online, live stream, YouTube, it never came. And so that's where I came in that night, writing an article about the conflict that was not recorded, as people thought the meeting was going to be recorded. So
you're saying that
go ahead.
sometimes what you think you're going to be covering isn't actually the most interesting part of the
Yes.
story.
So I've come to learn that sometimes the most boring agendas actually lead to the most interesting stories you don't expect, because there was really nothing on the agenda for this meeting. I was mainly going so I could introduce myself, and come to find out that the public made it a very interesting meeting. So that's kind of something I go back to when I think about how important it is to attend in person, meeting people, because you can't always expect that the technology or the live stream is going to work. Sometimes you make a relationship with somebody, they reach out to you or you reach out to them, and it doesn't immediately turn into a story. So that's another thing I kind of think about, is sometimes you make a connection and it's not like immediately they have a story for you. Sometimes they just want to gripe about something that they hate in their workplace. And so that kind of happened to me with, I was reporting on the Auburn School District. And as I'm sure many of you guys have with your school district, there's been a lot of transportation issues this year. And so Auburn School District was no different. And I kind of got in conversation with one of their employees, their union leader, because he wanted to gripe about the negotiations. I wasn't necessarily interested in writing about the negotiations, but what I was interested in writing about was why Auburn was having all these transportation issues. And so this was another really interesting story of mine. Was I kept chatting with this union leader, and I started to see how angry people in the bus driving community around here became as administrators kind of continued to talk about the issue. The administrators were saying there's a transportation shortage, and the employees and former employees were feeling more that there was a problem with the district. And so through this connection, again, I was not really that interested in union negotiations. I was able to talk with him, and he gave me a list of people who used to be employed by the Auburn School District and their contact information, former bus drivers. And I was able to get in contact with them and ask them why they left. And that was probably my biggest story I've written in my 6 months, was just a large story about dissatisfaction among Auburn bus drivers, and honestly how much they kind of hated their boss and they hated the work environment. And it seems really simple, but it was something that people were really interested in, because of course when the bus doesn't show up in the morning, that's something that has really big implications. And so it kind of blew a hole in the administration's explanation that the district's problem was just because of the shortage, because they had enough bus drivers, but the bus drivers were leaving for other opportunities. So I guess to sum up that kind of part is, I think about like, sometimes when you make a connection, it's not going to immediately lead to a story. It's just about keeping that connection, keep talking with them, hearing them out. If it's not something you're quite interested in, it might eventually be something you're really interested in. And don't be afraid to ask what you want. And so I was not quite sure if he'd be willing to put me in contact with his coworkers or his former coworkers, but I asked and he happily gave me a list of names and numbers. So One thing I use a ton as a beat reporter is social media. And so I know that's probably very familiar to all of you,
Mm.
but I can't stress enough how important social media is, particularly as a beat reporter. What I found that's really helpful is when I'm searching for stories, I'm in a lot of different groups. So on Facebook, I am in groups for a bunch of different Androscoggin County towns. I'm in groups, parent groups for all the school districts. Because when something big happens at the school district, generally someone posts it to that group because they want to discuss it with people. And so I probably get a quarter of my stories, maybe more, from social media, um, because I'm doing a lot of day-to-day stories and I'm looking to see like what are people talking about, what are they interested in. And I saw one of the advanced questions you guys gave was how quickly do you have to publish a story for it to be timely? And that depends. But sometimes as a beat reporter, you need to publish it that day. So if a letter goes out to families about an incident at the school, like you need to be calling up the superintendent right then and there to ask them what happened and writing that story to appear online that night or for the next day's paper. So one story I found on social media I was very proud of was about oil being stolen from a local church in this little Androscoggin County town that most people never really think about, Leeds. Their church had posted about somebody stealing their oil. And this was right as gas and oil prices were skyrocketing. So it was a tiny little a little local story that kind of showed the impacts of a much larger issue. And I and nobody else would have known about that story had we not been a part of a local community group that was talking about it. And so that story actually, weirdly enough, the Miami Herald ended up writing an article about our little church in Leeds getting their oil stolen,
That
which
was
is
a
just
great
fun.
story. That was a great story.
Oh,
That did really well for us on the websites. I think because it kind of hits on people's emotions, and it's an
mhm.
unusual angle for a topic that everybody is concerned about. The high energy costs, but it came at it from a different view. From with people desperate enough to steal it, rather than
Yeah.
just the numbers and the business side of it.
hmm It was really interesting, and it was yeah. I was really proud of that story, as tiny as it seems. Somebody stealing oil from a church. Um, but like you said, I think it spoke to a lot more and about the generosity of the community that stepped up to help the church even repay for it.
Mhm.
So social media is really big. I hate social media, but for me, it's again like looking for daily stories. It's where I find many of them. When you're not quite able to be in the community in person, it's the next best thing.
It's where the conversations are happening, especially
Mhm.
now more than ever. I mean, it used to be, there were town squares and, cafes and places like that where people would be having these conversations you could eavesdrop on. But now the conversations are happening on so many social media platforms. And so if you're not on those platforms, you're missing out on those conversations.
But what do you have to be wary of? What do you have to be careful of when you're relying on social media? Because there's the
Mhm.
very real danger of of something being untrue, especially on social media, where anybody could say anything, and it
Mhm.
confers a certain amount of authority because it's out there and lots of people are talking about it, but it may not even be right. So how can you guard against that when you're looking
Trust,
for a story?
trust, but verify is always the adage. They say if your mother
Mhm.
says she loves you, check it out. That's what journalists have to do. So you might get a tip from social media, but you can't be relying on that as gospel. You need to go
Mhm.
then report it and find out. And sometimes the tip is, exactly what's being presented, and other times it's a little bit different, and maybe that's a story too. But yeah, that's just the beginning of your reporting, not the end of it, right, Vanessa?
Yeah, and thank you guys for making that point. Um, I I never take social media as the last step. It's always something that
Mhm.
prompts you to call the superintendent, that prompts you to call the town manager, that prompts you to look for the documents. So yeah, as you guys said, it's the first step. It's not the last step. It's something to verify, but it can also be really useful to find people who are interested. And so sometimes you're looking for somebody in a town to talk to about a controversial issue. You're looking for somebody who cares that land next to the Androscoggin River is going to be developed. And so you can find those people through social media by looking at who's talking about what. So that's kind of another piece I use it for. There's a lot of people I've never met in person, but I talk with on Messenger on Facebook.
Great. Eric, let me ask you the same question that I asked Vanessa. How did you know this is what you wanted to do?
I hit on it pretty early. I always liked writing growing up. We didn't have any journalism classes in high school, but I always liked writing English and writing papers and things like that. Those were my favorite classes. And I read the newspaper. And I mean, I grew up in Westbrook, so I was reading the Portland Press Herald long before I ever got a job there. And so I thought writing, if I wanted to be a writer, I thought journalism was as good a way to get into it. You know, you get to write and create something every day. So that is what I studied in college, and I get into it pretty much after college. And like Vanessa, I've been doing this a lot longer than she has. I feel like I became the old veteran overnight, but I've been doing this about 18 years now. And for the first 7 or 8 years, I was a beat reporter like Vanessa, but then for up until pretty recently, where I took on a new beat, I was a general assignment reporter, which basically means I got to kind of do literally anything and everything. And let me tell you, it was the best job around. There were so many different types of stories that I got to do over a decade or so. And you know, sometimes, a lot of times, you're building off what's already happening in the news. So when we talk about ways to find a good story, number one, you got to be curious. You've got to always be thinking about, why did this happen? What's behind this? And I was always interested in the follow-up story. And by that, I mean, if something happens that's obvious news, you have to do the daily story on it. So a really good example of this that we talked about just before people came on. So several years ago, there was a strange police story about a woman's body who had been found in a mobile home in a southern Maine community. And that wasn't the news part of it. I mean, it was news that her body was found, but the news was that no one had seen her or heard from her in 2.5 years. She had literally been dead for 2.5 years before anybody found her. And so a colleague of mine and I did the daily story on that. But I mean, the obvious follow-up story was, what happened? How did this happen? Who was this woman? And so part of that involved going on a trip to New York, where this woman was from, and learning all about her life and how she ended up in this, you know, rural community in Maine in a mobile home where nobody talked to her and she didn't talk to anybody, and how she died and nobody knew about it. It was a really sort of sad but really fascinating story. Vanessa hit on some topics that we talked about earlier. I think, you know, the best stories obviously are people-focused stories, but I think you want to look for people who have something at stake. And so, you know, the best stories often have a tension to them, right? Something that, you know, they're trying to get, or they're trying to get past, or they're trying to overcome. I mean, even in fiction, the best stories are about, you know, journeys and people overcoming those sorts of things. There's a story I did a few years ago, and this was another thing that kind of happened organically. One of our photographers happened to be at the courthouse shooting arraignments, which are when people show up for their first court appearance for a crime. And one of our photographers took a picture of this older gentleman who had been there because he robbed a bank. And we weren't going to write that story, but the photographer came back and was showing the photo, and it was a really like sad, interesting photo. And we literally built a story off of that. So I didn't know anything about it, but I went down and got the court documents. That's another great resource for finding stories, is documents of any kind, whether it's court documents or other source material like that, are very helpful in finding good stories. But anyways, this guy, he basically robbed a bank so that he would get caught, so that he would go to jail, because he was so depressed and upset with his life, and he wanted out, but he didn't know what to do. And so I built this whole story around this guy who decided to rob a bank. And that was a really interesting one. And I ended up doing a follow-up story after that, because he wouldn't talk to me for that original story. We had to build it basically entirely from the court documents. But then after he got out of jail, he ended up reaching out to me, and we did a follow-up story there. Another good example of the documents that I was talking about, was a story I did a few years back about a strange adoption. So we wouldn't normally write about adoptions, and this was a case where two families were trying to adopt the same girl, and they both had sort of a claim to her for different reasons. And the case made its way all the way to Maine Supreme Court. And so there was this court decision that basically ruled which family was going to get to have the child. And so we didn't know about this case until that Supreme Court decision landed in our mailbox. And so you're reading through this court decision, and it's this 30-page document, and it's got all this stuff in it, and you're like, oh my gosh, I had to go find these people. I got to go find these people. And so I did that story too. I found the two families who were both trying to adopt this young girl and what their reasons were. That was a really interesting story that I did. Another story that I like to do a lot are sort of like sense of place stories. So Maine is just fascinating in so many different ways, but the best part of this job, the best part is what Vanessa said, going out into the community, going to where people are, going to where things are happening, and getting to see all corners of the state. And a good example of that also is building off of another story. So I can't even remember the year, it was many years ago, but there was a recount in a state Senate election race, and it was a very, very close race, and there were some disputed ballots. And the disputed ballots were in one of the islands off of Maine's coast. I think it was Long Island, I can't remember.
Mhm.
And so immediately we're like, oh, what's it like to count ballots and to be like the clerk out there on this island that's removed from the mainland? And so we went out there, photographer and I went out there, and we kind of built a story about how they felt about this disputed election, that their ballots were being questioned. And that was a good example of just, finding a place in Maine that's got a real character, because people in islands are very interesting for a lot of different ways. So those stories are always really, really, I think, rewarding to do.
Well, let me ask you guys, both of you guys, this, and this was actually a question that someone submitted in advance. How has COVID changed how you find good stories? Because, the best way is to go out and just mingle in the community and, just kind of maybe sit in a diner and let people come to you and just kind of let life kind of flow over you. But, for the last 2 years, we haven't been leaving the houses. People haven't been going out. You haven't been able to see people in person. So how do you find the interesting stories under circumstances like that?
That's a good question. I think, and Vanessa alluded to it a little bit, but the longer you do this, the more you have sources in different communities, right? People who know you, they know your work, they maybe trust you as much as you can trust the journalists. And they will, if you're good at what you do, you have sort of trained them in a way to come to you for story ideas. I'm sure Vanessa gets this a lot. I know I still get it from people that I first met like 15 years ago, people that I had as sources immediately after I got into this job, and have kept, and I'm not even working at the same paper I was, but they still know me because Maine is such a small state. And so if you do certain types of stories, or if you are interested in certain types of stories, people are going to come to you. So I think that is a huge part of story idea development and beat development, is getting people to come to you. I mean, it's also fun to come up with your own ideas, but sometimes the well is dry and you need people to be coming to you.
How do you get people to trust you enough to come to you?
I mean, you do it. You build trust one story at a time, literally. So, if somebody, and that's actually a really, I think, cool part of this job. I'm really drawn to stories that are sort of, emotionally heavy. People are trusting you with something in their lives that's very personal, that's very hard sometimes. And there's a huge responsibility to be the steward of that story, right? And to tell their story. And if you do it well, they'll tell other people. You know what I mean? And so if you are somebody who is upfront and honest, and you don't burn anybody, you're going to earn that trust. But I'll tell you what, if you lose it, you don't get it back. You know what I mean? Like, it's you basically spend your whole career trying to earn it, but you can lose it really quickly.
Vanessa, what's your advice on how to get people to trust you?
I think it's really just thinking about them before your story sometimes. Because like often when I'm working with people, I'll try to think about like what they've told me and what position they're in, and try to read through my stories with a lens of like, okay, if they're speaking critically about a person or an institution, is this something that's going to get them fired? Um, so I think like you stay true to the person, but sometimes you moderate a little bit of the intensity of their emotions, or sometimes there's certain really personal details they share and they'll share it on the record, but it's not quite necessary for your story. And so I think I really think it's just being a good person, and thinking like, would you want your name in this story if this were you? Maybe not the most straightforward advice, but like, I just try to just keep a humane thought
Mhm.
to it. So even if they like, I mean, even if you have on record that they like totally hate their boss or something like that, like if you don't need that in the story, like, you know. So I think it's just really staying in communication with people and trying to think about how an article published online with their name in it could impact them now and could impact them in the future, and just keeping that in mind.
We think about a lot that we think about that a lot more than I think we probably did when I first started out in journalism. We've really shifted the way that we cover, particularly courts and crime reporting. I think, for so long we took police reports and police press releases even as like the undisputed truth. We've learned more and more that it's just not. And so, there are examples where we didn't try hard enough to talk to somebody who was accused of a crime, and we just presented the police version as the version of the story. And then, when we found out that, that wasn't entirely true, sometimes we follow up on it, and not always, because we don't always see through every story to conclusion. So we've really, and Catherine would know about this more than Vanessa and I, because she deals with it a lot, but we've really sort of had a reckoning on that and shifted the way we cover some things. But I think Vanessa hit on a good point about qualities of a journalist is the best journalists I know are the most empathetic journalists. People who can sit with anybody, can sort of hear their story and not necessarily judge them in any way, and then find a way to tell that truthfully with enough context that it's going to appeal to a broad number of people. I mean, that's the other thing I think about a lot when searching for story ideas. We all have a little bit of vanity in this job. We all want our stories to have the biggest reach. I don't want to do a story that only 50 people are going to read. I want thousands and thousands of people to read it. I want it to be on the front page every single time I write a story. That's what I want. And so the way you do that is you make it interesting. You don't write boring stories, but also you find a way to make it contextual. And so even if you're writing about something that's really sort of intimate and micro, if you can find a way to make it appeal on a macro level, a lot of people are going to be interested in that. So that's something I think about a lot too. And we talk a lot about is context, setting an individual story in a broader context that makes it more interesting.
I
You
want
guys
to
have,
add one more thing really
yeah.
briefly that I think we took for granted is just getting things right. Um, like I think that is really the most important thing, is like double checking your information and getting things right. And trying to, when you're paraphrasing things, trying to paraphrase as similarly to their own words as you kind of can. Because there's nothing that'll get somebody to not trust you faster than getting something wrong.
Mhm.
Oh yeah,
That's very true.
no question.
You guys have talked about approaching stories humanely, and recognizing that the people that you write about are fellow humans, and kind of having a sense of empathy. So how do you handle it when you interview someone and you think they're lying to you? How do you get to the truth of that? Because not every story is going to be about somebody who's sympathetic. Not everybody deserves the benefit of the doubt.
Um, oh,
Go ahead,
Oh,
Vanessa.
I work with superintendents a lot, and sometimes they're a little tough because I wouldn't say that any of them have outright lied to me necessarily, but there's some people who really just don't give you the truth, or they'll give you the official story. And so that what I've kind of learned is the best thing you can do is talk to as many people as you can. And sometimes they're on record, they're off record. But sometimes you kind of just need to go in the back door versus the front door of a story. And if you have someone who's lying to you or you don't trust what they're saying, first off, you can kind of gently call them out on it if you know to the contrary, and just say like, hey, well, I hear what you're saying and that makes complete sense, but so and so, or told me this, and what do you have to say about that? Or other times it's just I would think I would stick with that, is just talking with more people to get a better sense, and not always necessarily approaching it straightforwardly, because there's usually people adjacent to an issue or adjacent to a story that you can talk to that can provide some insight.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the types of stories and the amount of time that we might have on any given story, I think, the degree to which you can verify somebody's account of something. I mean, if it's something particularly explosive or controversial, or something that's going to generate a lot of interest, and it's really, really incumbent upon us to make sure that we vetted it as thoroughly as we can. But I mean, every once in a while, there's going to be red flags there where you have to, I mean, we've pulled stories. I don't know if Vanessa's in this boat too, but like I've gone 90% on a story, had a really good story, and it got pulled at the last minute because we couldn't get to a place where we felt like we wanted to put our name and weight behind this story. And that happens too. But I think better to do that than to not be sure. Because I think I think the level of public trust in, I hate the word media because media is not a monolith, but the level of public trust in journalists is not always super high. So I think, any opportunity we can get to, show people that, we're people too. We're not some just big evil corporation. Everybody that writes a story and everybody that's involved with the story is a person too. And we think about these things far more than I think people probably realize, long before they ever, make it into print.
I think I'll go to some of our questions right now, because I want to make sure we leave enough time to answer a few. I'm going to start with a few that were asked live in the last few minutes. What are some things you can do in high school to start or prepare for a career in journalism?
Read as many things as you can. That's still how I come up with the best ideas and how I improve my writing. If you're not like reading, I read people I admire. I read magazines. I read other newspapers. I read nonfiction books. Sometimes I read fiction. I'll read the cereal box sometimes. I mean, seriously, anything you can read is going to improve your writing immensely. It's the best thing you can do.
I know that not necessarily a lot of high schools have journalism programs by any stretch of the imagination. Some do, and if they do, that's a great first place to start. I would also recommend, and this isn't going to like land in your resume or anything, attend some local meetings. Like attend your school board meeting, attend like your city council or your select board meeting, and just sit and listen. And like whether you're writing it for a publication or not, like try to put yourself in the place of what would you write, and trying to understand these things. I think just even like attending some of those meetings and putting yourself in that position, because like, for instance, a lot of what I do as like a very early career journalist is going to meetings and listening to like old men speak. And a lot of times it's also just deciphering what the heck they're talking about. And that's kind of a practice skill. Even if you don't know what they're talking about, practicing how do you figure it out is a good place to start. But good thing is, I mean, high school is just be curious, learn, like Eric said, read good journalism, read good anything.
Read bad journalism, so
read
you
bad
can tell the difference.
too. Oh God, bad journalism.
Should we be giving like examples of bad journalism here?
No,
You'll find it on your own.
I mean, yeah, I think if you read enough, you'll be able to recognize it, right? You can tell the difference.
Pull out a story and dissect it. Like take a moment, like list out who did they talk to for the story, like what was the point of the story, like I know these maybe sound a little too much like academic exercises for somebody just interested in it, but I think really just kind of trying to put yourself in the shoes is a really great thing. And the good thing is, like, being in high school, like, it's not going to get you a journalism job no matter what you do in high school. So kind of putting yourself in a position where if you're interested in being a journalist, finding yourself a college that has a good program, whether it's a journalism major or not, is, I think, kind of more important perhaps.
Did you major in journalism, Vanessa?
No, I majored in geology. That's
But I
another
think
thing.
having a wide background and a lot of interests is more important than majoring in
I
journalism.
bring that up because I think a lot of, I have a journalism degree, but most of the people that I've worked with over the many years don't, and you don't have to. There's certainly things you can learn in journalism school, and I enjoyed it, but that's not necessarily a prerequisite for getting a journalism job.
My unprofessional, unexpert opinion is major in something else, but go to a school large enough to have a really good active newspaper. Because I think you learn more on the job than you necessarily learn in a classroom, but you need people to learn from.
That's
Also,
I didn't
working at a
necessarily
college
have that.
newspaper is the most fun you're ever gonna have in a newspaper.
And
It's so much fun.
stressful, particularly if you don't know what you're doing and you're supposed to be the person who knows what they're doing. So find a school that has a good newspaper, and learn something else, is my personal opinion.
I would actually have to add something to that because I didn't work at my college newspaper. And it was a very big college and they had an active, great paper. I majored in English. So that's where I learned to write, but I didn't actually do any reporting. But what I did do after college was move to a small town. I moved out of California and I moved to Alabama and worked at a small newspaper there where you get to cover everything because they didn't have a lot of reporters. So I was covering business, I was covering features, I was covering breaking news and crime. And like Vanessa said, getting the on-the-job experience is invaluable, far more, I think, than working in a classroom. And I actually have a journalism degree too. I went to graduate school for journalism, but I do think that working at the small newspaper in real life and, you know, earning that paycheck by the things that I wrote probably trained me to be a much better journalist.
Sorry, Eric.
Let me ask another question that was asked live. What do you do when you find a story uninteresting? Like, how do you make it interesting? Do you write it just to get it off your plate, or do you just let it die?
I mean, that's actually kind of a cool exercise. Is if, I mean, sometimes you're gonna be assigned stories you don't want to do. That still happens to me with some regularity. But you can approach it two ways. You can be like annoyed about it. So I usually am annoyed about it at first.
Yes, I know. I've been
whine
your
about
editor.
it, and I say, I don't want to do the story. This sucks. I don't want to do it. And then I get over that, and then I'm like, oh, all right. I think let's see what I can do with this story. And so then you are presented with the challenge of taking something that you're not that interested in and making it interesting to everybody else. And that's actually one of the cool challenges. And I think, you know, the way you do that is by, I don't know, talking it out with your editor. You're saying, I don't think this story is that interesting. How can we make it more interesting? I talk to colleagues sometimes. I'm like, oh, I got to do this story, but I don't think it's that interesting. How can I jazz it up? Who can I talk to make this interesting? And I think, you know, the more you talk about it, either with your immediate editor or with coworkers, the more you can kind of coalesce around something that, you know, will get you to where you need to be. Now, something that I still haven't quite mastered, and I've been doing this way too long to have not mastered this, is, you know, not every story you're going to do is going to be the story that you share with high school journalists or that you remember 20 years later. Like, I've probably forgotten more stories than Vanessa's done at this point. You forget about so many stories that you've done, and that's okay. You know what I mean? But I think, you know, being able to recognize when a story has more potential, that's actually where I really kind of I like to go. You know, because any story can just be a, you know, 500 word, get it done with story, but you know, there's only a few that you can really, and if you recognize them, you can really do something special with. And I love looking out for those stories. But honestly, like, sometimes those stem from really uninteresting assignments too. Like you never know. And I think if you're always curious, if you're always kind of open-minded about it, you know, you'll find it.
What characteristics would you guys say are vital to being a journalist? Whether or not, leaving aside the degree and the writing experience and where you went to school, like what do you actually have to have?
You have to be able to call somebody on the phone and not,
Or stop somebody on the street even.
or stop somebody on the
Mhm.
street. And those can be learned skills. Like you can definitely develop those skills, but at the very basics, you need to be okay with talking to perfect strangers and calling them up with random questions. That was
And
something I
getting a
really
door
struggled with.
slammed in your face. That's a hard one.
Or, oh God, I struggle a lot with rejection. I'm always sometimes so worried about walking up to somebody and talking with them or calling them or sending them controversial questions because I'm afraid they're going to be like, you're a terrible person. But yeah, you have to
There
be
is,
outgoing
yeah, Vanessa's right.
enough.
I don't necessarily think that I'm an extrovert by nature. And so I think one of the hardest things to this job was, putting yourself out there, making the number of phone calls, like cold calls you have to make. You have to call often strangers. Sometimes you have to meet strangers on the street and ask them sometimes very personal questions. That's a big hump to get over. But I think you do it by being what we talked about before, by being curious, by being empathetic, by letting them know that you're a person and you do care about what they have to say, and that you're not trying to exploit them in any way. And sometimes what I do, and I have the benefit of some experience now, is if I have a little bit of time and I'm writing a story that's a little bit that someone might be worried about, like whether or not I'm going to exploit them or whether or not I'm going to not treat their story with the care that it deserves, I'll send them a couple stories I've done that might be similar. Be like, look, this is what I do. This is a story that I wrote a handful of years ago that dealt with a similar topic. I'll do the same for you. Like, just give me that chance. But yeah, I think, we hit on some of those things. I think you definitely have to be curious. You have to be empathetic. You have to be firm too. Like there's going to be opportunities where people don't want to answer your questions or are trying to it's not just people who want to share their stories with you. It's trying to get information from people who don't want to share that information, whether it's politicians or other public figures. Like you have to be firm and you have to ask good follow-up questions to get the information that you need. And you can't let them skate by on a non-answer. You have to, kind of be assertive.
I'd also argue you need to be somewhat of a, I don't know if passionate person is necessarily the thing, but like this is a job where you're not working. And there are some versions of journalism when you are working a 9-to-5 job, but a lot of like what we do is not necessarily confined into business hours because news can happen at any time. And so you have to be somebody who can have, I feel like, have something inside of you that wants to go the extra mile, and recognizing that sometimes you're going to be working until 11 o'clock at night and that's like what it's going to be. Or just knowing that sometimes like you might have a really basic story, but you know that you can do more with it with more effort. I think being passionate about the world, about your community, about stories and people and issues is a pretty important trait, because this isn't really the kind of job you can skate by on just doing the bare minimum. I mean, you kind of could, but you're
You
not
won't be
gonna.
a good journalist.
You're not really gonna go far.
Yeah.
You don't have to be passionate about everything. God knows I'm not passionate about like what I'm writing today. About excuse me, don't laugh. About like whether there's going to be like local festivals this summer, but it's got to come out for some of the most important issues, I think.
I think it's important too to be paying attention to things that are happening locally in your community, statewide, nationally, internationally. I mean, we're always doing stories that build off of things that are happening in different parts of the world. Obviously, we've been writing about local stories about what's going on in Ukraine and with Russia and that sort of thing. I mean, the gas prices. I mean, we've written stories about that are local stories, but they start with national conversations. So for many years, because I did a lot of different types of stories, I found that, unless I wanted to spend the first 3 or 4 hours of my day learning, starting from the beginning of learning about the topic I had to write about, or, being pretty well versed in most things that were happening. And that's actually like the coolest part of the job anyway. It's like you get to like learn.
Hmm.
That's literally your job. Like we get to learn stuff all day. Every day I'm learning something. It's awesome. If you like that sort of thing. If you don't, well, you'll hate this job.
I think that's all the time we have for now, but I really want to thank you guys for talking with us, and especially all of our guests for taking the time to show up here. I hope this was informative and it helped you think about a potential career in journalism. We'll be doing more of these, focusing on different aspects of the news, like sports reporting or photojournalism, or how to conduct interviews. There's probably a lot we didn't cover, so we want to hear your ideas for potential topics for future sessions. Feel free to drop any of us a line and let us know. And I mean it when I say we really do want to hear from you, not just about future ideas, but your thoughts on how this session went, what worked for you, what didn't, what you want more of, what you want less of. So thanks again for coming. And
Yeah, thank
please
you, everybody.
continue to support your local news organizations. We rely on your support and your feedback. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.
Great.